So I'm here to find out.
I think we've gotten a couple new people since.
If Sauron's just a big eye, what's he going to do with the ring?
He'll use it to take over Middle-earth or reclaim his old powers he had.
Am I the remainder?
Yes.
Whatever he pleases with it. Was that the question? What song?
Yes. I'm Tom, and I have no idea. Stupid question. I originally did this paper for a conference, at which it was accepted, but one of our daughters was inconsiderate enough to schedule her wedding around the same time, so there was no way I was going to Oxford that week to give it up. But here it is. Its original title was Juvenile Trash and Modern Moral Philosophy. If some of you are familiar with Elizabeth Anscombe's essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, that makes a brief celebrity appearance in the paper. The most common criticism of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is that it is juvenile. And an influential review of Lord of the Rings, I think it was Return of the King, by the American critic Edward Wilson, when the book first came out, it appeared in 1956. It was entitled, to give you some idea of the tone of the review, "Ooh, those awful orcs." One is puzzled to know why the author should have supposed he was writing for adults. There are, to be sure, some details that are a little unpleasant for a children's book, but except when he's being pedantic and boring the adult reader, there is little in The Lord of the Rings over the head of a 7-year-old. It is essentially a children's book that has somehow got out of hand. The core of Wilson's criticism concerns Tolkien's treatment of evil. Moral distinctions are telegraphed in the most obtuse fashion possible, right? By non-moral aesthetic properties. Good characters are beautiful, evil ones are ugly, just as they are in children's literature. Furthermore, Tolkien represents moral judgment as easy. And finally, while modern literature represents evil as a psychological phenomenon, Tolkien crudely reifies it in particular characters, those awful orcs, whose evil is a brute, unmotivated fact. So the story has to have bad guys, so we're going to have these orcs running around being bad. His explanation for the popularity of The Lord of the Rings: certain people, especially perhaps in Britain, have a lifelong appetite for juvenile trash. He does indicate what would have rescued the book from the juvenile realm to his satisfaction. One looks forward to a queer dilemma, a new kind of hairbreadth escape in which Frodo in the enemy's kingdom will find himself half seduced into taking over the enemy's point of view, so that the realm of shadows and horrors will come to seem to him, once he's in it, once he is strong in the power of the ring, a plausible and pleasant place, and he will narrowly escape the danger of becoming a monster himself. Well, Wilson was a literary critic and not a philosopher, so I accept that his views on Lord of the Rings represent a literary judgment. Wilson seems to think that a work of fiction that misrepresents good and evil and how moral judgment operates in the actual world is flawed as literature. But questions about the nature of good and evil and moral judgment are philosophical questions, not literary ones. So if a philosophical case can be made that Tolkien represents good and evil realistically and presents a plausible account of the problems and risks in making moral judgments, that would seem to absolve the work of at least that literary flaw. And that's the case I'm going to try to make, besides defending the, I hope, provocative claim that the rings of power are the least fantastic element of the story. Well, for one thing, moral judgments are not easy at all in Tolkien's world, right? I mean, it's just any story that has as one of its most memorable lines, "All that is gold is not glitter, not all those who wander are lost." That emphasizes the dangers of judging by appearances, has at least faced the issue. But one of the things I think that Tolkien focuses on is the risk of moral judgments and moral commitments. None of the characters, good or evil, is motivated at first by a desire to do evil. For nothing is evil in the beginning, Elrond tells Boromir. Right? No. Even Sauron was not so. Characters are evil in Tolkien because they've been corrupted. And among the more insidious roots to corruption are moral judgments and moral commitments, rather than think that temptations would be the grounds of corruption. It's actually moral commitments. One of the most striking features of Tolkien's story is how often the means of corruption turn out not to be a character's flaws or weaknesses, but his good qualities and his good intentions. The most obvious example, I suppose, is Boromir. What Boromir values, Gondor and Minas Tirith, is worth valuing, and Boromir is neither morally obtuse nor morally ignorant. It's this full realization of the good that's at hazard that makes the ring such a temptation to it. Saruman is corrupted through a sense of responsibility for Middle-earth so that he studies the arts of the enemy. We're told that Denethor is the wisest steward of Gondor for centuries, and it's precisely through his wisdom, his knowledge of what those crystal balls are for up in the White Tower, the Palantir, and his knowledge of the history of Gondor and how much it's declined, that Sauron uses to corrupt him. Sauron makes him believe that defeat is inevitable, so Denethor despairs. Even Frodo fits the pattern. Frodo's most obvious quality in the story, I think, is his thoughtfulness. Frodo takes things in. His experiences affect him. You remember Bilbo, I guess we'll see this in The Hobbit, the most terrifying adventures roll right off Bilbo's back, right, leaving his cheeriness and invincible self-satisfaction untouched, where Frodo's wounds never heal. Right? He's very sensitive to the claims of others. He has a tendency toward abstraction. He's always surprised when his friends have figured out what his plans are, because he never bothers to share them. I conclude that far from being juvenile, Tolkien's representation of moral judgment serves as a profound meditation on the hazards of making moral choices and acting on one's commitments. The conclusion even a moderately careful reader should draw is that not everything is black and white. Rather, that after having made a moral commitment, you constantly have to re-examine your goals so that you're not led to do evils whose greatness is measured precisely by the strength of your desire to do good. Concentrated single-mindedly on one good while ignoring others, or seeking one good long after the circumstances have changed, can be as corrupting as a vice. Meaning well in Tolkien counts for nothing. Main part of the argument. Tolkien's conception of good and evil isn't juvenile. It's pre-modern, which is not at all the same thing. I'm using pre-modern here in the same sense in which Elizabeth Anscombe uses modern in her influential essay, Modern Moral Philosophy. Anscombe argues that moral philosophy, since Hume, has been conducted under assumptions that make progress impossible. The conceptual resources necessary for progress can only be found in pre-modern concepts that modern moral philosophy was thought to have superseded. Many critics, like Wilson, would have encountered these pre-modern concepts only in their religious training as children, which may account for Wilson's confusion. Aristotelian moral concepts pervade Catholic thinking, and Tolkien's Legendarium came to display a distinctively Catholic understanding of the moral realm. Critics committed to a modern conception of evil will view this as a blemish in his work. The critical issue, or the philosophical issue here, is whether it is one. One of the Aristotelian conceptions developed in Catholic moral thinking is the view of evil as a kind of deficiency. Evil is not a psychological state or an epiphenomenon of politics. It has a metaphysical status, although a complex one. Tolkien captures precisely this sense of evil in his notes to W.H. Auden's review of Return of the King. In my story, I do not deal in absolute evil. I do not think there is such an evil. I don't think there is such a thing, since absolute evil would be zero, would be nothingness. I do not think that, at any rate, any rational being is wholly evil. Satan fell. Modern philosophy psychologizes the concepts of good and evil. Good is identified either with a mental state like pleasure, or with a psychological capacity like autonomy, or as a placeholder for whatever we approve of. For Aristotle, things are good to the extent that they have a coherent nature, and therefore an end. The good of living creatures is their end, which is to thrive, and a living creature is a good creature of its kind to the extent that it has, or has developed, capacities enabling it to thrive. By analogy, the Shire is good because creatures can thrive there. Mordor is an evil place because the properties it once had that made it capable of supporting flourishing life been stripped from it. What makes creatures evil? Some creatures, like Wilson's awful orcs, are indeed evil, but their evil is not brewed. It's not a sort of groundless authorial posit, To get the plot going, the story needs bad guys, so we'll have these orcs running around being bad. Orcs are evil because they've been corrupted. As Tolkien recounts in the Silmarillion, some elves were captured during the Elder Days, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. It is not an uncommon psychological process for an addict, someone with a gravely disordered appetite, to hate his addiction, to turn his hatred into self-hatred, then to direct that self-hatred outward in rage against the whole world, and then to wish to pay the world back for his reduction to the state, to prove a villain. And who would such a creature hate most? Those like himself who have been spared the corruption. Contrast this conception of evil with the queer dilemma Wilson proposes as a less juvenile version of the story. In Wilson's version, Frodo would have come to adopt Sauron's point of view, which amounts to seeing the blight and horror of Mordor as pleasant. In short, an evil person is one who is in a particular psychological state whose evil consists in his adopting a particular point of view. Wilson's modern moral outlook apparently allows no place for a deformation of natural appetite rather than mistaken perceptions, such that the subject craves blight and horror, not because he misperceives them. Such a person might even see them in all their ugliness, yet still crave them, and hate that craving. Tolkien's portrait of Gollum, I think, presents just such a moral deformation. To anyone who has witnessed a gravely disordered appetite, alcoholism, or drug addiction up close, Gollum's unworthiness, his untrustworthiness, his resort to self-pity when his deceptions are exposed, his exploitation of the pity of others, his manipulative skill in making his companions feel like hypocrites, the dissolution of his personality, form a shockingly realistic portrayal. There is nothing juvenile about it. And what makes good creatures good? The most significant difference between Tolkien's world and ours seems to be that Tolkien's characters, understanding the nature of things, bestows a capacity to affect them a bit more directly than we can. The wisdom of Gandalf, and Elrond, and Galadriel is displayed not just in what they know, but in what their knowledge enables them to do. Sam calls it elvish magic, and the elves are just puzzled, because to them it's just natural knowledge. However, just as in our world, acquiring such natural knowledge requires discipline and self-mastery, using the power requires effort and comes only at a cost. It's a trope in Hong Kong kung fu movies that mastering martial arts requires such discipline and self-mastering that by the time you've developed the power to kill somebody with your pinkies, right, you've turned into the sort of person who wouldn't. Dangerous knowledge, then, is safe in the hands of the adept. If circumstances warrant the use of the knowledge, we can rely on the adept's judgments. The creative exercise of this knowledge also requires great effort, concentration. All this seems to be true of Tolkien's characters as well. To be good in Tolkien's world is to have power, to possess capacities. The good-making capacities are tied to functions and ends, just as they are in Aristotle. Certain objects, the Silmarils, the Palantir, those crystal balls, Galadriel's mirror, but most prominently, the Rings of Power, seem literally to be concentrations of some character's knowledge. In those objects, the power flowing from knowledge has become concentrated and reified in a physical object. And since it's concentrated in this object, it swings free of its original possessor. It's sort of odd sort of Marxist alienation process, where you produce the thing, it's alienated from you and can be used either in your stead or conceivably in your absence. It's as if, Jackie Chan could, just by his mastery of kung fu, create an artifact that could beat you up without involving him, right? He could just rely on it instead of performing the function himself. This feature of Tolkien's world explains why certain objects are risky to use. Power may become separate from knowledge as well as from the knower. This is one of the ways that the rings constitute a danger. The rings are a threat in another way, too. As embodiments of the power that knowledge gives, the rings function as substitutes for that knowledge, as things that can be worked independently. This seems to have different effect on the natures